Welcome back to Supreme Myths. I am very excited today to have as my guest Professor Ciara Torres-Spelliscy of Stetson University. She is a graduate of Harvard and Columbia. She worked for the Brennan Center. She is an expert on election law, corporate law. She's written too many articles, essays to talk about, but she's written a bunch of books, including Political Brands, which I reviewed a while back for Dorf on Law, and her new book coming out in a few months called, I have trouble pronouncing the first word of the title, but Corporatocracy, How to Protect Democracy from Dark Money and Corrupt Politicians. And there is nothing we need more than protecting democracy from corrupt politicians right now. Thank you for being on Supreme Myths.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited about this. So in the very beginning of this book, you talk about American democracy being, quote, a pathetic state, and, quote, on a knife's edge. Those are two different ideas. One is that it's terrible, and one is that we may lose it completely. Go ahead and explain what you mean by those two kind of related but different ideas.
Sure. So this is a book about corruption. And I think about corruption coming in several different flavors. The two that concern me the most are individuals who try to stay in power when it goes against the voters' will. That's one brand of corruption. And then there's an entirely different brand of corruption, which is someone who has been lawfully elected, but they abuse their position of power for personal gain at public expense. And I deal with both of these aspects in this book. And I'm really trying to urge my fellow citizens to use what I call a democracy litmus test, to think about what they are doing and whether it's good for democracy or not. And I want them to do that as voters. So, if you elect an election denier, it's your own fault that you put someone in power who doesn't believe in our democratic processes. Sort of similarly, because I focus on money in politics, I'm a campaign finance lawyer. I also am concerned about the funders of our candidates and have a political system which allows the wealthy to bankroll our politicians. And I think that leads to all sorts of pernicious results.
Yeah, I want to go back to corruption for 1 second because on this podcast, once a podcast, I have to mention Judge Posner. I'm going to do it right now. So everyone has heard of Citizens United, but a lot of people I found in my travels haven't heard of the McCutcheon, and I'm trying to pronounce it, the McCutcheon case, where somebody, a very, very wealthy person, wrote a check in Arkansas or Alabama someplace and sent the check to a politician in California. And the Supreme Court, and it violated, I don't care what the limits were, it violated some limits. And the Supreme Court struck it down. And here's what I want to say about it, and I want to ask you about it. Roberts wrote the opinion, and Judge Posner, writing in Slate at the time, before he got sick, he's now sick, said the following. He said, Justice Roberts is either lying or stupid, and he's not stupid. Because what Roberts said that's what Posner said, as a sitting judge, he said, and he wasn't sick yet. He got sick, but he wasn't sick yet when he said that. Here's what I want to ask you about. So what Posner says, Roberts says, is that the only kind of corruption that has a legitimate interest for regulators to deal with is direct quid pro quo corruption. That's the only kind. And if they're not doing that, what they're doing is violations of this, that, and the other thing, including free speech. Writing a check is not free speech. When I write a check to my dry cleaner, it's not free speech. It facilitates speech when I write it to a politician. What is wrong with our Supreme Court when it thinks the only legitimate avenue for legislators to legislate when it comes to money in elections is quid pro quo corruption? Because there's so much more corruption than direct quid pro quo, in my opinion. But you're the expert, so tell us.
So I've written about this a lot, possibly ad nauseum. And one of the ways I think about it is that the Roberts Supreme Court is regulating corruption. And they have redefined what counts as corruption in both campaign finance cases and white-collar crime cases. So in the white-collar crime cases, you have cases like McDonald. So this was the Virginia governor who gets his daughter's wedding paid for and rides in a Ferrari and is prosecuted for essentially corruption and goes to the Supreme Court, and they say there were no official acts that Governor McDonald did for this donor that he wouldn't do for any constituent. I think if you believe that, I have some swampland to tell you in Florida. It's just kind of laughably ridiculous. So that's
what Posner thought. That's what Posner thought. That was laughably ridiculous is about what he said to me privately.
So they're doing that both in the white-collar crime cases, but they're also doing that in the campaign finance cases. So as soon as Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito join the court, and we lose Justice O'Connor because she retired to take care of her dying husband, and then Rehnquist literally dies, they were reasonable on campaign finance. They weren't like campaign finance fans by any stretch of the imagination, but you could make a strong legal argument with a thick congressional record, and they would see the wisdom. They saw the wisdom of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in McConnell case from 2003. But they are off the court, and by the time we get the first campaign finance cases out of the Roberts Supreme Court, which is a case called Randall versus Sorrell, it's so clear that this has been a huge shift. And the only thing that changed were the justices on the court. And every chance that they get, they deregulate campaign finance and they define corruption more narrowly again and again and again.
Yeah, and that's a great way of putting that. And I'm going to get back to your book in 30 seconds. I had a colleague here who wrote a book. Who wrote a book that made the following argument, which I know you're going to agree with. This, for the non-lawyers listening to this may put it in perspective. He wrote a book saying that, and he's a free market guy. He's a capitalist. He's a free market guy. But he wrote a book saying we shouldn't, that model for economics should not be used for elections. And the Roberts Court basically moved to a free markets view of elections. And that's just wrong and dumb for a zillion reasons. And I think he's right about that. So what I want the audience to understand is it is basically the Wild West when it comes to elections. And if you're a free market capitalist and think that's what the economy should be, fine. We can debate that. But no other country on earth, I don't think, runs their elections like that, right? Where it's just total free market, almost total free market. It is total free markets, right? There are limits on contributions, but they're easy to get around, right?
Yeah. So our campaign finance system has most of its roots in the 1970s as a reaction to the Watergate scandal.
Yes.
And there was, after Watergate, and this sort of blows my mind, but 1 out of 4 letters into Congress demanded that they fix the campaign finance system. Because one of the things that came to light in Watergate was that the Nixon campaign, which was the Committee to Re-elect the President, which has the awesome acronym CREEP. CREEP was using illegal corporate donations to fund things like the Watergate burglary. So they were using.
Wait, Char, I'm sorry, Char. Sorry, I got to interrupt.
Sure.
I have to interrupt. You probably haven't seen it. I hope you haven't seen it because it's so painful. Tucker Carlson, who, by the way, just announced a show in Russia. No surprise there. I saw a TikTok thing of his a few days ago. You would not have believed this. This is what Tucker Carlson said. He said it was all a conspiracy to get Nixon, that the Watergate burglars were all CIA, FBI, that the cover-up, that the getting of Nixon was done by the CIA, the FBI, in conjunction with rich liberals, and that Nixon did basically nothing wrong, and that it was all a bit. He just said this like 2 days ago about Watergate. What?
Yeah, well, that's ridiculous.
Yes.
And not true.
Yes.
Trust me, I really in my academic career, I spent quality time with all of the reports that came out of the select committee that looked at Watergate.
Yeah.
And it is so tall that if you stack them end to end, they were taller than the books that were created by this committee that looked into all of the scandals. It is literally the size of a human being.
Right. Also, he also kind of ignores the fact that the attorney general, the chief of, they're all put in prison. Sure, anyway, let's get back to you. Okay, let's get back to your book. Sorry, I want to redirect. I do want to get back to the first question though. Knife's edge. How much of a knife's edge are we on right now, do you think? And is Trump the cause, the result, or the beginning?
That is the $1 million question. So I feel like we're on a knife's edge because Trump has not been held to account, and neither he nor any of the other architects of January 6th have been held to account yet. And I should be clear for those who are listening to this maybe a year in the future where you know how this story ends. We don't. None of Trump's criminal cases have resulted in a conviction of anyone, including his 2 January 6th cases. So we have the one out of Georgia, we have the one in DC. They are both on pause as we wait for the Supreme Court to make a ruling on presidential immunity. Right. And I was pretty disheartened by that oral argument that they seem to be entertaining the idea of presidential immunity when, and what's extra strange about this is, A, I wouldn't think that that would apply to breaking laws, like just in general, and B, the president has no role in running a presidential election. So I think that the 11th Circuit, who has had to deal with a very similar question arising out of Mark Meadows, trying to move his case to federal court, they basically said to him, no, you don't have a role in administering a presidential election. So the types of immunity that he was trying to invoke also don't apply. So I hope that the Supreme Court takes that lesson from the 11th Circuit, from a very conservative judge who wrote that opinion, and goes that way with this. But that does not appear to be where their heads were, at least during oral argument.
Here's what I don't understand about that. And again, we're deviating from your book, but you say such interesting things that we have no choice. What I find so weird about that is obvious. It's so obvious to me that a country can't have the incumbent president overseeing the fairness of his own election. I mean, it's one thing if the Department of Justice has to investigate election fraud when it comes to state actors or even senators and congressmen. But it's a whole other thing. A judge can't be the judge of their own case. We know this. This is the first rule of law, basically. You can't be a judge in your own case. But if we let the president play an active role in his election, he's the judge in his own case in some sense. It's obviously wrong. And every time anyone at the argument headed anywhere towards that direction, they were cut off by the conservative justices who would not talk about the facts.
Yeah. And so why I think we're sort of at a knife's edge here is we have an individual who tried to have an unearned second term in, I think, a failed coup d'etat on January 6th. And he is the front runner, and I think the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party for the 2024 election. And so it's going to be on us, the voters, to make this decision.
Well, let's hope so. Okay, going back to your book, which I'm holding up right now, because your book is great and has a bunch of different chapters in it that are related, obviously, but they stand on their own and it's fascinating. So I'm going to ask you about a couple of the chapters. You talk about, you use the phrase, it's a scary phrase, civil death. You wrote a chapter on civil death, which just sounds terrible. What is? I know what it is. I read the book, but what is civil death?
Yeah. So I just wrote a piece for Law and Crime about civil death and Trump and the chance that if he is convicted in Manhattan, that he is going to lose his right to vote in Florida, because if you're convicted of a felony, then you can't vote in Florida.
Right.
So
that would be fun. That would be funny. That'd be great, by the way. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I leave it in the hands of these skilled jurors. So civil death is a very broad and old concept. It is the phrase that summarizes the collateral consequences of a criminal conviction. And it goes all the way back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So in ancient times, if you were convicted of a serious crime, you lost all of your civil rights, hence civil death. So you couldn't serve in the military, you couldn't serve on juries, you couldn't vote. And this concept moves throughout time. So it gets picked up in medieval Europe. It goes over to England. It takes a really weird turn in the British common law, and they had this concept of outlawry where a convicted felon loses all rights. And not only does the convicted felon lose all of their rights, they also had what was known as a corruption of blood, which meant that the felon couldn't give property or titles to their heirs.
Wow.
So then the concept comes to colonial America and is widely adopted in early statutes, because we're basically, we were a British colony. We adopted British common law. Interestingly, in the original Constitution, there's a moderation that is shown by the founding fathers. One of the things that they get rid of is that weird corruption of blood concept. So even if you're convicted of treason in the United States under the U.S. Constitution, we don't take it out on your kids.
Right.
And I think that was moderating and a sensible reform. After the Civil War, you get, I think, a sense of vengeance. The North, who is writing the new amendments, so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War, they really distrust the South, who they had to fight an entire civil war against.
Seems fair to me, but go ahead.
Yeah. And so they add in two aspects of civil death that had not been in the U.S. Constitution before. One was the penalty clause, which said that essentially they were trying to incentivize the South not to take the vote away from Black men. So it said, if you take the vote away against some of your male citizenry, you will lose part of your congressional delegation. But we won't impose that penalty if the reason why you are taking the vote away is because someone has a criminal conviction.
Right.
And thus, that civil death of taking away someone's vote is put into the Constitution for the first time.
And I assume you think this is a huge problem today. Go ahead. Explain why.
So civil death, I think, has at least a few weird interactions with corporate power. One interaction is that in 48 states, when you are incarcerated for a crime, you lose your right to vote. This is not how other modern democracies do this. So it's only in Maine and Vermont and DC where you retain your voting rights even while you're incarcerated. And that means that there's this whole voting block of, depending where you are, hundreds of thousands of people in a given state have no voting rights while they're in prison. And then many of them don't have voting rights for most of the rest of their natural lives because of the way a state like Florida, for example, makes it almost impossible to get your civil rights back. So that voting bloc cannot vote against corporate interests that they find pernicious. And then the other way that I think corporations get to benefit from civil death is the loophole that is built into the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment says famously, we abolish slavery in the United States. And then there's a big loophole that says except as punishment for a crime. Right. And it's that loophole that is used by corporations that use prison labor. And many times it is forced prison labor where you really do not have a choice. And the reason why that is unconstitutional is the 13th Amendment.
A lot of what rang in my head when you were saying all that was how badly and wrongly we do prisons in general. That I guess I'm not a prison expert or anything like that, but it hit me. I would think what other countries have thought about or decided probably is that's a good thing for these people in prison to vote. It makes them feel like they have a say in things. It makes them feel like when they get out, they may have an ownership interest or whatever, vaguely defined in whatever's going on. I can't think, why would we not want them to vote?
Well, I think there is this vengeance streak in us. Maybe it
But
goes
isn't
back to
but
the
vengeance,
Puritans. I mean,
but that's for the victims. I get the whole. I mean, we should make sure the victims are whole, and everything we get. Absolutely, I'm all in favor of victims' rights. But here, the victim is the country.
yeah, it is a really sticky wicket, but again, to bring this back to the corporate aspect.
Yeah.
I think it's not an accident that one of the few publicly traded corporations to give to Trump in his original 2016 run was a company called Geo Group. They run private prisons. And right at the end of the Obama administration's DOJ had decided that the federal government was going to get out of the business of private prisons.
I remember. I was so happy about that.
Suddenly, with the election of Trump in 2016, that gets reversed. And Geo Group did very well with all of the private detentions at the border. Like, a lot of that was done through private prisons. And so you can see that Geo Group is still giving to right-wing politicians, because that is part of their business model. And I think that is where it becomes really quite creepy that someone is making money off of imprisoning people. And then you have, on top of that, this 13th Amendment problem of the potential for forced labor in that situation as well.
Well, you had me at private prisons, because that's a ridiculous phrase. It's a ridiculous thing, and it should not exist. To make the profit motive the major part of prison system has to be one of the dumbest ideas in the history of humankind. We've had all kinds of corruption scandals with this too. Pennsylvania, right? This judge kept sending kids. Anyway, okay. So that's one chapter.
Scandal. I didn't even put Cash for Kids in this book, but yeah,
I know.
Absurd.
Yes. Okay. So that's one chapter. It is fascinating and sad. And I hope people pay attention to it. And another chapter, and this is news came out yesterday. We're taping this on Wednesday. Yesterday, news came out that they said some staffer of Trump's, but I actually not sure what to believe. But there was definitely a Trump advertisement where at the end of it, he promised to create a unified Reich, as in the Third Reich, as in Nazism. So now they say it wasn't on purpose and they deleted it, but we know what they're doing there. It's not hard. So given that news, you have an entire chapter here, which I frankly was pretty ignorant about corporate enablers of the Nazis. Corporate enablers of the Nazis. Given, I think, the intersection today in America between, I won't call them Nazis, but very, very right-wing individuals who sit on big, powerful corporations and Donald Trump. This is a big issue for America today. So go ahead. What do you mean when you say corporate enablers of the Nazis?
So, where to begin with this one? I've spent a lot of time over the past 4 years worrying whether America is on a Hitler-esque timeline. And what I mean by that is Hitler also had a failed coup in the 1920s. And then by the 1930s, he was a dictator. And part of what enabled him to come to power was corporate funding. So it all sort of hinges in 1933. In 1933, at the very beginning of the year, the Nazi Party is broke. It's worse than broke. They are in the red. And that could have been the end of the Nazi Party. But they invite people to Hermann Göring's house. And the people that they invite are titans of industry. And Hitler is there too. Hitler gives this explicitly anti-democratic speech where he says the next election is going to be the last election. And they hear this anti-democratic speech, and then they give him millions of marks.
Why? Why did they do that? Why? Why?
I mean, I think that getting into the why of it, I probably don't have the psychology degree to explain. But I think they thought that they could control Hitler. And I think that was a grievous, grievous mistake. And when Hitler is in power, they use slave labor in their companies. And some of the men who were at that meeting at Goring's house, including the executives from Krupp, Flick, and Farben, they are then prosecuted after the war as war criminals. And the primary charge against them is their use of slave labor during the war. So, and some of these executives are convicted. The punishments, I think, were pretty light given the actual war crimes that they were found guilty of, but at least there was some punishment. And what I worry about today is that those who are the money men will get together with a modern day anti-democratic candidate. And it's that fusion between corporate largesse and anti-democratic politicians that I think we really need to police and try to prevent it from, prevent that marriage from happening.
So I want to say something nice to you, don't get embarrassed by this, but you're a very, very careful scholar. And I noticed there that you could have said a modern day Hitler, but instead you chose a modern day threat to democracy or whatever it is you said, which is a much better way of saying it. But I want the audience to understand that, at least in my opinion, I don't think there's anything Donald J. Trump wouldn't do. Nothing. I don't think there's any limit. If someone said to him, you can be president again, but you have to do X. X is killing 6 million people. I think he would. I think if they said you have to throw Hawaii to Japan, I think he would. Whatever it is, I'm making stuff up, but there's no. So I don't know if he's a fascist, but I do know he would do anything to regain power. Do you agree with that?
It's hard to know what he's capable of. I think what I can barely talk about is the evidence of what he has done.
Yes.
So I spent the summer of 2022 glued to congressional hearings from the January 6th committee.
I'm sorry.
And I was probably maybe a little unique in that, but I think they did a really excellent job of showing all of these different plots to try to overturn the 2020 election.
Yeah.
What has been really soul crushing for me is one of the things that I keep an eye on is the polling of Democratic, future Democratic voters, future independent voters, future Republican voters. And the question that has been asked ever since January 6th is, do you think that Biden was lawfully elected in 2020? And the percentage of Republicans has hovered around 60%. And then who think that Biden was not lawfully elected. And then Trump supporters, it hovers around 70%. And I thought, well, maybe this would be true right after the 2020 election or right after January 6th. It has remained true for the intervening 4 years. And I think that is really the scary thing. And I think to one of your earlier questions, like, is Trump the start or the end of something? In some ways, Trump is almost like this strange caricature of a man. What really sort of keeps me up at night is the millions of people who believe him.
Yeah, but that's been the case with most people like Trump. So just to be clear to the audience and for you, I didn't do this until about 3 months ago, but it's the first time I ever said it. So this has not been the case for 6 years. I've hated Donald Trump since 1989. I'm from New York. The whole Central Park 5 disaster, I've hated him ever since. But what I want to say is only in the last few months, I'm going to make some analogies for a second, okay? Michael Jordan is probably the best basketball player ever. But at worst, he's number 2 or 3. I mean, we can debate Bill Russell, whatever. At worst, he's 2 or 3. We can debate how good the Godfather movie is, or picking any movie, Cuckoo's Nest, All the President's Men, whatever. They're great movies. Everybody would agree with that. Great things happen to us, and terrible things happen to us. He is my phrase for him now is he is a generational evil. Michael Jordan was a generational player. I think that we've had generational. Meryl Streep is clearly a generational actress. He's a generational evil, and I think different rules apply to him. So that's why I said what I said. I don't think Steve Bannon is terrible. This guy Miller is terrible. They're all terrible, but they're not generational evils. He is. I think Trump is. So I put him in a different category, and I'm troubled that America doesn't see it. That he is unique. That not unique, but he is almost unique. Or he is. These people don't come around very often. And when they do...
And I think one of the indications of that is, ever since 1801, when John Adams gives the presidency over to his political enemy, Thomas Jefferson, we have had peaceful transfers of power between our political parties.
Yes.
And that came to a screeching end on January 6, 2021. And I feel like this is underappreciated for how outside the norm this is. I mean, even during the Civil War, you didn't have Confederate flags at the Capitol, and you did that day.
Part of me wants to acquire all, I don't know, pick a number, 8th grade classes, 10th grade classes in America, to just for 1 hour on a loop play Walter Cronkite after every election saying the miracle has happened again. Because I was a kid when he did that. I got tingles when he did that. I was like 14. Here we are again. We're going to accept that half lost, half won, and the people that lost accept the rules of the game, and we have forever. So you're right. I mean, once Al Gore could have played this very differently, and he didn't. Okay. You have another chapter, fascinating chapter. Speaking of corporations and Nazis and elections, on the corporate role in Stop the Steal. It's a very complex, actually a very rich chapter, so we can't do justice to it here. But could you give a couple bullet points from that chapter?
Sure. So right after January 6th, hundreds of corporations came out and made statements that they would no longer support those Republicans who had refused to certify lawful votes for then President-elect Biden. And this got my attention because corporations are usually not in the business of saying that they'll stop spending in politics. And I think the long and the short of this is it didn't last. It didn't, for some corporations, it didn't last 6 months, but sort of in the intervening years, hundreds of corporations went back on their own word that they wouldn't fund these people, and they have. And I think that's a really depressing data point. My friends over at Crew, I just looked this up before this interview, there have been $143 million in corporate and trade association money that has gone to what some call the sedition caucus, as in the people who refused to certify the Electoral College votes on January 6th. And the reason why I think that is so significant is, so you have the violence on January 6th. The Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police finally clear the area so that our members of Congress and our senators can come back and finish the count. It is after they've cleared out the violent people that these objectors still won't certify the election, which is why it takes until the morning of January 7th for them to finally give up and actually certify the 2020 election. And that's why I think the culpability is stronger than I think a lot of people do. Because I think if you forget the timeline, you're like, oh, they were objecting, and then there was a riot, and then they behaved themselves. Actually, there was a riot, then they objected. And only after, I think, hours and hours of debate in each of the houses do they finally relent. So there's that way of thinking about corporate funding for these individuals.
Yeah.
Most of whom were reelected in the midterm.
And we're talking about the leaders of the Republican Party, right? I mean, didn't they Cruz and Graham and all those people vote not to? Right before we started taping today, this is again Wednesday. It'll probably come out Friday. Once we started taping, right before we started taping, I noticed that Marjorie Taylor Greene, yesterday I think, or maybe this morning, said that the Biden administration, she tweeted that the Biden administration and the Biden Justice Department had plans to execute Donald J. Trump. And what she bases that on is that the people who went into Mar-a-Lago to get the classified documents were instructed that they were allowed to use, and I don't know if this is true or not, lethal force should they have to use it. But even if that's true, which I don't know if it is, but even if that is true, saying you're authorized to use lethal force if someone gets in your way is not going to Mar-a-Lago to execute Donald Trump. My point here is, but that's not what she said. The headline is, Biden administration planned to execute Donald Trump. No one is holding her to account. No one is holding her responsible for this. And when I say no one, what I mean by that is if Coca-Cola and Home Depot in Georgia, both companies headquartered in Georgia, wanted her out, they'd find a way. They would bankroll an opponent. They would find a way. They're rich enough, powerful enough to probably find a way. Why aren't they doing that? Like this person, she's a threat. She's a clear and present danger to our country. If our country goes down the tube, so will capitalism. Don't the corporations realize that? Like, I don't understand. Why isn't someone taking care of these crazy people? When I say taking care of, I mean getting them out of office.
Yeah, I mean, political coups and political instability are not good for capitalism.
Right.
It is in some ways completely puzzling. There was a little bit of momentary corporate bravery when after
1-6, yeah, but it didn't last long.
1-6, there was that, and then in Georgia, when you were about to pass a particularly restrictive voting law.
Yes.
Some of your corporations for like 5 seconds.
Yes.
A little bit of a fight. And then
maybe 3 seconds. Maybe 3 seconds. I will say that Home Depot and I think a couple others did beat back a terrible LGBTQ law a few years ago. They did do that. I have to say that. But overall, I just don't understand. I don't understand why these corporations are allowing Trump to quit and Marjorie Taylor Greene and all of these people to cause such chaos and disruption, which can't be. Anyway, I don't know. I guess one theory might be that all they really care about is their corporate profits and the stock market. That those things are doing well and they don't care, but I don't know. Okay. You and I have agreed on every single sentence and word so far. We are about to disagree, which is probably a good thing. Otherwise, it's boring. You talk about the disqualification clause in the 14th Amendment as being underused, I think is the phrase you use. And I get the sense from your book you would rather it had been used, maybe even on Donald Trump, but certainly more than we're using it. You make the point, which is a good one, that almost no one's been disqualified. One person in New Mexico was, but almost nobody has been disqualified. Not many ran for office, to be fair, after that, but I think some did. Anyway, give me your take on January 6th. The audience knows that I was not in favor of the court enforcing January 6th. I was in favor of Congress maybe doing it, but I wasn't in favor of the court.
Yes. So the disqualification clause is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and it, in short, says that oath-breaking insurrectionists can't hold public office. And so there was an effort after January 6th to first kick off members of Congress from the 2022 ballot. All of those efforts failed, including against Madison Cawthorn, which I read about in this book.
Yeah.
And then the move went to state officials. So there's this guy named Couey Griffin. He was the head of Cowboys for Trump.
Cowboys for Trump is the dumbest thing ever. He's a New York real estate guy. Sorry, go ahead.
Everyone agreed that Couey Griffin was not violent on January 6th, but everyone also agreed that he was cheerleading violence on January 6th. And then he gets a criminal trespass conviction for his behavior that day.
Right.
was very important to the court that was looking at his disqualification. They said that there wasn't a difference between the violent insurrectionists and the cheerleading insurrectionists. They considered them all the same. And they disqualified Huey Griffin from holding his position as an Otero County Commissioner. You might think, how much damage can an Otero County Commissioner do? Well, one of the things he did while he was in power is he refused to certify an election because it was being run on Dominion voting machines. So
Right.
even people like little tyrants with their little internet control, they can do some damage. So he is disqualified. His case goes up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court denies cert, which leaves his disqualification in place. Then we get to the main show, which is there were multiple attempts in multiple states, at least 31 cases by my count, trying to get Trump off of the 2024 ballot using the disqualification clause. 3 states actually do it. So Colorado, Maine, and Illinois. The Colorado case is the one that arrives at the Supreme Court's door. They grant cert, they hear oral arguments, and then they unanimously decide that their way out of all of this. So there were many questions in that case, including, does this clause even apply to the president? Which oath matters? And instead of wrangling with either of those questions, they sort of decide that states can't disqualify federal officers, and that Congress needs to pass clarifying, implementing legislation that would apply to federal officers. So they sort of go a dual sovereignty towards all of this, which is not the worst thing. It means that states still can disqualify state officials, and so that would apply to the Huey Griffins of the world. And that is not nothing. The ability to get those sort of, coup-supporting officials out of power at the state level, I think is important. But I think it's also means that now it's up to the voters in the 50 states and DC to show up and make your preferences known in the presidential election, because the court is not going to save us.
Can I ask you about a weird connection that I made about? I wrote a lot about Section 3, and I come from a position. I'm much more skeptical of Trump than the Supreme Court, but I'm pretty damn skeptical of the Supreme Court, as everyone in the world knows. So that listens to this. So give me just a little bit of rope here to ask you a question, because it just hit me a few months ago, and I think. So I've always been of a European nature when it comes to free speech. I think free speech is obviously incredibly important. I think we, the United States of America, for example, no political ads are allowed in England prior to the 30 days or 60 days or something to a campaign. I'm in favor of that. That might be a good. I don't know if I'm in favor or not, but I don't want judges deciding the legality of that. That would be illegal in America, unconstitutional in 10 seconds. It would be. The Supreme Court would never allow that in 1,000 years. And there's a lot, and so anyway, I believe in free speech strongly, but I'm not an American nut about it. I think the problem with Trump and January 6th was that in any other country in the world, that speech would have been considered part of the insurrection. In any other country in the world. In our country, really liberal, progressive law professors were very worried about that speech being part of a, disqualification effort, yelling free speech. And I think that's absurd. I think either it's leading to an insurrection or it's not. If it is enticing, leading to, and urging on an insurrection, then I don't think the First Amendment should apply. If it's not doing that, then the First Amendment should apply. And in this case, it's obvious what he was doing. He wanted them to go to the Capitol and attack it. It's just so I don't know where I honestly don't know where you stand on free speech. But do you think I'm crazy to make that point?
I think that's a lot more reasonable and nuanced than a lot of the discourse.
Okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. Okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. Okay, going back to your book because we're running out of time. I have a question about the effects of corporations and Citizens United on elections. It's not really about Citizens United, but about the cases that came after Citizens United that really opened the floodgates. And here's my question: one of the arguments that I get from conservatives and moderates sometimes is that Citizens United did exactly the same thing for unions that it did for corporations. And there's no difference. Whatever applies to corporations applies to unions. And now I'm not a big believer in free speech of either one. But leaving that aside, have unions been helped by the fallout from Citizens United? And if so, why are liberals so upset if unions get the same treatment? And historically, at least in the Northeast, unions are really liberal and Democrat.
All except the police unions.
Yes, fair enough. Yes.
Just its own strange phenomenon.
Yes.
So you are right.
Is it a fair question? Is it a fair question?
Oh, sure, totally.
Yeah.
So I don't write about unions in this book. I have written about them in other pieces. So there's been this very weird false equivalence that has been built into U.S. statutory law. Here's the short history of it. So corporations were banned from spending in federal elections in 1907. And
by the way, history and tradition. We would think that would count, but go ahead. Sorry.
And then after World War II, when the Republicans finally get control of Congress, they sort of make it one of their missions that if you're going to do that to corporations, we're going to do the exact same thing to unions. And so the corporate and union ban get sort of twinned, if you will. They get entwined. And so after Watergate, when we're having more reforms, there's always this parallelism between, okay, if we're going to ban something for corporations, we'll ban it for unions too. And that was true in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, otherwise known as McCain-Feingold. So there's been this sort of equal treatment under statutory law for corporations and unions for a really long time, which meant that when in Citizens United, we get rid of two different corporate bans. One is for electioneering communications. That's the one from the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. And the other one is from Taft-Hartley from 1947.
Right.
And when they get rid of those two things, they also get rid of the parallel restrictions on unions. Now, the reason why I call this a false equivalence is the biggest corporations have more money running through them than many small nations. And the biggest corporations have money running through them that rivals a medium-sized country. And there's just not an American union that has that type of funding. So it is true, Citizens United is good for unions too, but the ability to spend an unlimited amount of money is always going to be by how much money do you have? And, you know, if you're the Exxons of the world, the Chevrons of the world, you have a lot of money to throw around. And if you're the teachers union, you have some money. It's not nothing, but it's nowhere near the biggest corporate funders.
That's the answer I get from most. I think that's the right answer. I'm not sure that's the Supreme Court's fault. I got to think through that a little more. Like, I don't know if I'm the Supreme Court and I'm committed. I don't know. I understand why the court would treat them the same. I just think the court took such a wrong turn on all of this that there's no way really to repair it. All right. We're about out of time. At the end of your book, you have a whole chapter on proposals. I remember writing my first book. I did not want to put any proposals in. And at the time, both my agent and the publisher were like, no, we need proposals. The American people want proposals, put proposals. Your book needs them, and your book has them, and they're really good. Can you give us like three most important proposals? Whether they're likely to change or not, don't worry about that. Just what do you think needs to change?
Sure. I think that we need better transparency of corporate money in politics. I think dark money is a real problem. In the 2020 election, there was $1 billion of dark money where the public has no idea where it came from. Fix that, and that will give accountability both for voters. They can figure out who's bankrolling these candidates, and it also protects shareholders. This is other people's money that's being spent in politics. So I think they have a really strong interest in knowing as well. Number two, more public financing. part of what makes all of American politics really vulnerable to criminals is having reliance on private financing. We didn't even get into the pros of the Fugees spending illegal money to help
Right.
elect Obama. So you have to buy and read the book.
Actually, I want to make that point. Hold on a second, though. I'm sorry, Char. I do want to make that point. You do have a chapter here on the 2012 election. It is so for people who think that Char is some bleeding heart liberal, who not so. I mean, this is a book written by someone who is looking at it from really all. You are progressive, I think, but the book is written from I think a perspective of equal treatment. And when things went bad in 2012, from your perspective, even though you got the president, I assume you wanted, and I wanted, there are things that are bad, and that was I love that chapter. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk to it. So one proposal is get rid of the dark money. Second proposal is
get more public financing so that candidates are not reliant on private money. And then, and I think you'd like this one, no more gifts for Supreme Court justices. Our public servants, if you can't live on your public salary, go into the private sector. Many law firms would be happy to have you. You can have a no-show job where you're considered a rainmaker. Leave us alone. Do something else with your life. But if you're going to be a public servant, then be a public servant and don't have these off-camera, benefactors.
I'm so glad you said that last thing, and wrote that last thing about Supreme Court justices and gifts. Not that is far away from the center of this book, but it's an excellent observation. So it gives me the chance to say something I've been wanting to say for a long time, which is, I clerked in 1983 for a federal trial judge in Atlanta, and then the 11th Circuit in 1986. I clerked for a very conservative Republican trial judge by the standards of the day. Today he'd be a liberal, but back then he was very conservative. And my judge at the 11th Circuit wasn't political at all, moderate Democrat. What they both told me at the time, in no uncertain terms, was in the pros and cons of deciding whether to be a judge. They're both successful lawyers. One of the cons was they wouldn't be able to socialize with their friends. They really told me that. Like, we could probably have a dinner once a year. We go out Dutch. But in terms of what we really would like to do, just for leisure time, socially, we're under substantial constraints. And they both felt that. And they both felt sadness for it. But it was a trade-off. Being a judge is great. And having like tenure is great. They really felt that. And when I clerked, there were 12 judges in the Northern District of Georgia. I knew most of them. I think most of them felt that way. One turned out to be a neighbor of mine, and first chief judge, Northern District of Georgia, and she felt same thing. Like, we had to really limit our social lives. That's part of the price of being a judge. Where's that gone?
I wish that applied at the top.
Well, do you think? I think it might have back then to most of them. I think that was part of being a judge. I think that's what we thought of as being a judge. You can have friends and you can go to movies and stuff, but you don't get to accept trips, leisure trips. You can accept work trips, but not leisure trips. And now they're taking private yachts to faraway locations. It's crazy. If Crow had said, "I'll give you this trip if you vote X," we know that's illegal. But that's basically what he did, effectively. Because Thomas complained about the salaries. Thomas said, "I might quit." He did. He said that. He went to Congress, said, "You pay us too little." That's when the gifts started coming.
It's not a great look.
It's not a great look. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. The book is called Corporatocracy: How to Protect Democracy from Dark Money and Corrupt Politicians. And even more than Supreme Court justices acting badly, which has been my focus for the last 30 years. This book is as timely as a book can be. When does it come out? And when is it available for pre-order?
It's available for pre-order right now everywhere.
Yay!
Books, and then it'll be out later this fall.
Terrific. I really recommend it to everybody. I think it is a combination of two things: very, very smart and very, very accessible. And that's the whole game right there. If you can do that. Thank you so much for being on Supreme Minutes.
Yeah, it was a joy. Thank you.